Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
For most people, the Ozark Mountains are a symbol of peace and natural beauty. A place where one escapes from the hustle and bustle to enjoy the silence. In October 2016, for three best friends, Karen, Stella, and Edna, this scenic spot was supposed to be just that, a short weekend getaway. But their hike along a trail in Roaring River Park turned out to be a silence of a very different, ominous sort. The last time they were caught by security cameras was on the way out of town. Then, only an empty SUV in the parking lot at the start of the trail. A massive search with dogs and volunteers yielded only one strange clue. A trail that breaks off at an old logging road and a pair of crushed sunglasses. Where could three adult women on a popular trail disappear without a trace? For 16 months, the question has kept their families in suspense and stumped Missouri State Police. The case became a cold case, and then, on a cold February night, the door of a gas station 70 miles from where they disappeared swung open. Standing on the doorstep was one of them, emaciated, barefoot, and with scars from shackles on her wrists. Her appearance was the beginning of the end of a nightmare and revealed a secret that was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. October in the Ozark Mountains is a deceptive time. The air, still summer warm by day, takes on a cold, penetrating hue by night, and the dense crowns of oaks and hickories flash their last colors before the long winter. It is during this picturesque but treacherous season that three best friends decide to escape the city routine. Karen Warren, a 28-year-old nurse known for her pragmatism. Stella Gomez, a 29-year-old architect with the soul of an artist. And Edna Howell, a 28-year-old teacher whose calmness balanced her friends, all longed for the quiet and clean forest air. Their relatives later recalled that the trip was a symbol of freedom for them, a brief adventure before adulthood finally took hold. Their choice was Roaring River State Park, a popular but expansive place full of secluded trails. Friday morning, loading their backpacks into Stella's trusty SUV, they left Springfield. The last objective evidence of their route was the security camera footage from a gas station in the town of Cassville. The fuzzy, grainy image captured their car turning off the highway at 10 hours and 14 minutes in the morning. Karen's hand appears in the frame for a moment, tossing an empty paper cup into a trash can. It was their last documented action in the civilized world. They headed to the start of the Fire Tower Trail, known among hikers as a challenging but rewarding route that leads to an old fire tower with panoramic views of the wooded hills. The trail, remote from the main campgrounds, was virtually deserted on weekdays. It was this solitude that attracted the girlfriends. The first alarm sounded in quiet dissonance on Sunday evening. Edna, the most punctual of the three, had promised to call her mother no later than 8 o'clock in the evening. The call never came. At first, the family wrote it off to lack of communication in the mountains, a common occurrence in these parts. But when Monday morning brought no news, and the phones of all three were still out of range, panic began to set in. The worried relatives contacted the park authorities. On Monday morning, one of the rangers, making a routine detour, found their SUV in a small gravel parking lot at the entrance to the trail. The vehicle was neatly parked and locked. The dust lightly covering the windshield suggested that the car had been parked there for at least 24 hours. Inside, on the seats, were guidebooks and a couple of sweaters. No signs of forced entry or struggle. However, a cursory inspection revealed a disturbing detail. There were no purses, cell phones, or keys in the car. The girls had taken the essentials with them, as if they were going to return in a few hours. One of the largest search operations in Barry County history was launched. Missouri State Police, Dozens of community volunteers and specially trained canine units methodically combed through every foot of dense undergrowth. The weather, which up to that point had been favorable, began to deteriorate. Cold rain turned the trails to mud, complicating the work and washing away any potential tracks. Canine calculations were initially successful. One of the dogs, a German shepherd named Zeus, confidently picked up the trail from the parking lot and led the group down the main trail. The dog led the searchers for nearly 3 miles, going deeper into the woods. But then something strange happened. At the intersection of the hiking trail with an old abandoned logging road overgrown with weeds, Zeus stopped abruptly. He whined confusedly, circling in place, unable to pick up any more scent. The trail broke off so suddenly, as if the women had simply vanished into thin air. It was here, on the edge of this forgotten road, that the searchers had found the only item that could be considered evidence. Pressed into the dirt, almost invisible, lay Karen Warren's sunglasses. One of the temples was broken, and the lens was cracked. Was this a sign of a struggle, or had she simply dropped them, and later someone accidentally stepped on them? Experts were unable to give a definite answer. Investigators interviewed everyone they could find, a few locals, hunters, park employees. No one had seen or heard anything. Dozens of versions were put forward. An accident? Maybe. The area was rife with sinkholes and hidden caves, but could 3 experienced hikers fall at the same time without leaving any trace? Wild animal attack? Unlikely. There were no signs of a struggle. Slowly, the darkest theory began to emerge. A kidnapping by a calculated and careful criminal, perhaps a serial maniac, who used the logging road to take his victims. After 2 weeks of intense but fruitless searching, the operation was officially scrapped. Resources were exhausted, and hope of finding the girls alive had all but faded. The case of the disappearance of Karen Warren, Stella Gomez, and Edna Howell was transferred to the archives and became a cold case. For the police, it became another unsolved mystery. For their families, it was the beginning of an endless nightmare, stretching over a long 16 months of waiting and suspense. The Ozark woods that were supposed to be a vacation spot swallowed them up without a trace, leaving behind only silence, emptiness, and a pair of crushed glasses on the muddy roadside. 16 months is an eternity when it comes to a missing person. In that time, hope dries up, turning into a dull, aching pain. The case of the hikers who disappeared in Roaring River Park became covered in archival dust, becoming one of the many tragic legends of the Ozark woods. Life went on. For the night clerk at the Phillips 66 gas station, it was an ordinary, unremarkable February evening. The cold wind howled over the deserted highway. Rare trucks whizzed by, leaving a plume of wet snow behind them. Inside, under fluorescent lights, there was a sleepy silence, broken only by the humming of refrigerators. Suddenly, this silence was broken by the sharp ringing of a bell above the door. The door swung open with such force that it hit the wall. Into the lighted room burst a figure that seemed to be woven from a nightmare. It was a woman. She would later be identified as Karen Warren. But at that moment, she barely looked human. Emaciated to the point of being skeletal, with sunken, feverishly burning eyes, she stood swaying in the middle of the sales floor. She was wearing a dirty men's t-shirt, too big for her gaunt body, and on her feet, something that looked like shoes made of rags wrapped tightly with gray duct tape. As she stepped to the counter, the light of the lamps revealed ugly, deep scars on her wrists, like plastic tie marks, and a dark, frayed band around her neck, as if from long wear of a collar. The clerk, a young guy named Seth, froze, instinctively reaching for the phone under the counter. The woman let out a hoarse, plucking scream that Seth would later describe as the sound a wounded animal makes. "They're over there!" she wheezed, pointing with a trembling hand somewhere in the darkness outside the window. "He's gone, but he'll be back. Help!" At that moment, professional instruction and human instinct worked flawlessly. Seth pressed the emergency door lock button and dialed 911. The police patrol arrived with astonishing speed, less than 7 minutes later. The officers caught a shocking sight: a pale-as-a-sheet clerk and a woman huddled in a corner, shivering uncontrollably. Being in a state of deep shock, Karen was nevertheless able to give them the most important thing. Between convulsive sobs, she pointed over and over again to a barely visible, unpaved road leading away from the highway into a dense, dark forest. She kept repeating the same name, known only to the locals: Blackwood Ridge. It was a private, isolated area, the notoriety of which was passed around in whispers. 20 minutes later, a SWAT team was on the scene. They acted quickly and coherently. Approaching an old, abandoned farm, the soldiers saw a dilapidated house, the windows of which were roughly boarded up. It looked uninhabited, dead. But Karen couldn't lie. After a short order, the group went in for the assault. The door flew off its hinges. Inside, in the semi-darkness of the living room, a surreal sight awaited them. There was a man sitting in an old rocking chair. He paid no attention to the heavily armed fighters who had burst into his home. His blank stare was fixed on the screen of an old television, showing only hissing static. It was Elias Crenshaw, 36 years old. He offered not the slightest resistance, only continued to mumble incoherently about purification and evil as the handcuffs were snapped on his wrists. But the farm's worst secret was not hidden in the house. In the backyard, disguised as a pile of rotting boards and old junk that had once been a barn, was the entrance to an underground bunker. The steel door was locked with a massive deadbolt. When a hydraulic tool ripped it off with a deafening rattle, a nauseating, concentrated odor of damp, filth, and despair hit the officers in the face. Turning on powerful flashlights, they descended into the stinking, damp, windowless room. And what they saw made even hardened veterans shudder. On a filthy, soaked mattress in the corner lay a woman. She was in a catatonic stupor, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, unresponsive to the flashlight beams. It was Stella Gomez. Beside her, trying to shelter her with her body, was Edna Howell. Her condition was critical: severe anemia, signs of old and fresh beatings. But she was conscious, and she was 8 months pregnant. One person was missing. There was no second brother in the house: Silas Crenshaw, 38 years old. Already in the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, Karen told him that it was he, the prophet, who had chased after her when she managed to get out. Realizing that she was able to make it to the highway, he did not return to the farm. He disappeared into the woods he knew like the back of his hand. That same night, one of the largest and most desperate manhunts in the state's history began. Armed, mad, and cornered, Silas Crenshaw was now game in his own woods. Before we go any further, I'd like to address everyone watching this video. Stories like this one are complex and take a lot of work to recreate. If you find this material important, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave a comment. Every such action helps YouTube's algorithms realize that this topic is worthy of attention and allows more people to see the story. Your support is the only way investigations like this can continue. Thank you. Events: October 2016, January 2017. To understand how 3 free women became prisoners of hell at Blackwood Ridge, we must go back 16 months. The picture of what happened has been painstakingly reconstructed in bits and pieces from Karen Warren's hours of interrogation. Her memories, fragmented and burned by trauma, became the only window into the early days of their nightmare. That day, Karen recounted, the weather was perfect. The sun was breaking through the fall foliage, and the air was crisp. As they walked a few miles down the trail, they saw two men up ahead. They looked like typical locals, probably hunters, dressed in camouflage with backpacks over their shoulders. They didn't cause any alarm. One of them was sitting on a fallen tree, while the other stood nearby, looking worriedly at his leg. As the chums came closer, the one standing turned to them with a friendly smile. He explained that his brother seemed to have misplaced his foot and badly twisted his ankle. Karen, being a nurse, instinctively stepped forward to offer help. She knelt down to examine the man's leg, while Stella and Edna stood beside her. At that moment, as Karen recalled, the world narrowed to two sounds, a quiet click and a piercing, high-pitched buzzing. A sharp, paralyzing pain pierced her neck. Her muscles cramped, and the last thing she saw before consciousness left her was Edna's frightened, wide-open eyes before her body collapsed as well. It was a perfectly played-out scene, a trap that slammed shut in an instant. The next awakening was in absolute, impenetrable darkness. Such darkness, Karen had said, did not exist in the ordinary world. It was a heavy, crushing blackness, devoid of the slightest glimmer of light. The air was stale, smelling of damp earth, mold, and something sour. She lay on the cold, hard concrete. There was a low moan. It was Edna. Then another, very close. Stella. They were together. That realization brought a fleeting relief that was immediately replaced by an all-consuming dread. They were trapped. The room turned out to be a small, soundproofed basement. They would later realize it was an underground bunker on the grounds of Blackwood Farm. Their captors, the Crenshaw brothers, had established a cruel and insane order. From their rambling, mumbling sermons to their captives in the dark, a monstrous picture of their psychology began to emerge. The brothers, suffering from a severe form of induced delirium, were convinced that the outside world was infected with sin and doomed to a fiery purification. They believed they were destined to become the progenitors of a new, pure humanity. And for that, they needed women. The conditions of confinement were inhuman. There was a bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. Once a day, without any schedule, a heavy door creaked open and a bowl of food was thrown into the darkness. Sometimes it was leftovers from their table, but more often it was cheap, canned dog food. For 24 hours they might not see the light of day. The brothers set strict rules, the violation of which was punished immediately and severely. The first rule was to call them fathers. 2. Never speak to each other. 3rd, always look at the floor in their presence. The first weeks were a blur of terror and disorientation. They tried to support each other in whispers when it seemed the fathers were asleep. But the brothers heard everything. Karen remembered the day Edna, crying with hunger and despair, had quietly asked her if they would survive. The door of the bunker immediately swung open. One of the brothers stood on the threshold, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light from the corridor. He didn't say a word. He simply walked slowly into the bunker, a short piece of thick rubber hose in his hand. The year 2017 was a time when the concept of time lost its usual meaning for the captives. In the dungeon at Blackwood Ridge, there was no change of seasons, no dawns or sunsets. There was only an endless cycle of darkness, punctuated by the harsh light of an electric lamp and the sound of heavy bolts opening on the other side of an armored door. For Karen Warren, Stella Gomez, and Edna Howell, life had narrowed to the perimeter of a 12 by 12-foot room where the air was saturated with the smell of mold, ammonia, and animal fear. According to Karen Warren, which she later told detectives, it was during this period that the horrible hierarchy that the Cranshaw brothers had established was finalized. It was a system built on insanity and brute force, with each of the brothers having their own role in destroying the women's identities. The youngest brother, 36-year-old Elias Crenshaw, was the overseer and executioner. The victims called him the executor. His presence in the bunker always meant physical pain. Elias was physically developed, but his behavior resembled that of a child given power over defenseless creatures. He relished his advantage, using the slightest excuse to punish. Karen recalled that Elias would often go down for no apparent reason, just to feel in control. If any of the women looked up without permission or failed to get into the proper pose, a blow would follow. He used a rubber truncheon, or just heavy fists, striking in such a way as not to damage vital organs, but to cause maximum pain. His laughter, low and intermittent, became a sound that made the girls chill inside. He was an instrument of terror, a brute force that broke bodies. The real terror, however, came from the older brother. 38-year-old Silas Crenshaw had taken on the role of prophet. His madness was of a different kind, cold, calculated, and ideologically based. He was the think tank of this inferno. Silas was convinced that the world on the surface was doomed to perish in the fires of sin, and only here, underground, could the seed for a new humanity be saved. Silas spent hours in the bunker, reading sermons of his own composition. It was a wild mix of biblical quotes taken out of context and paranoid conspiracy theories. He made women sit on their knees on cold concrete and listen to his ramblings about cleansing. But the worst part was what followed the sermons. Silas called it unity rituals, but the criminal code considered it systematic rape with extreme brutality. He approached the process methodically, without emotion, as if he were doing hard but necessary work. For him, it was not an act of violence, but a sacred action necessary to create a pure generation. Women were subjected to this almost every day, one at a time, transformed from human beings into nameless vessels in the brothers' minds. The turning point came on May 14, 2017. That date Karen remembered because Silas had accidentally left a week-old newspaper on the table. On that day, Stella Gomez, who had previously held her ground as best she could, had refused to follow Silas's orders during one of his sermons. She kept her eyes down and quietly said she hated them. Silas's reaction was instantaneous, but not like Elias's. He didn't hit her. Instead, he told Elias to bring the box. It was a structure of rough boards, hastily constructed. Its size made it impossible for an adult to straighten up or lie down properly, only to sit bent in a fetal position. Stella was forcibly pushed inside. The lid closed and the light disappeared. Silas said she had to undergo a complete cleansing by silence. The box was left in a corner of the bunker. For the first 24 hours, her friends heard Stella screaming, beating her hands on the walls and begging to be let out. Elias only kicked at the crate, demanding silence. On the second day, May 15th, the screaming changed to quiet crying and then to incoherent mumbling. Karen and Edna tried to approach the box as the brothers left, whispering words of encouragement through the gaps between the boards. But all they heard in response was heavy breathing. The box was not opened until 3 days later, on May 17, 2017. When Stella was dragged out, she was a different person. Her muscles were so stiff she couldn't unbend, her skin was bloody against the rough wood, and her eyes were staring at one point, unfocused. She didn't utter a word. She broke down, From that day on, Stella was completely silent, sinking into a catatonic state from which she would not come out, even during the rituals. She became a puppet, devoid of will. After that, Karen Warren realized that if they wanted to survive, someone had to take responsibility. Edna was too weak physically. Stella withdrew into herself. Karen became the unspoken leader of their little group of doomed. She realized that open rebellion meant death or the box, so she chose the tactic of quiet resistance. At night, as the hum of the ventilation system grew louder, drowning out the sounds, Karen would crawl over to her friends. She massaged Stella's atrophied muscles, forced her to sip water. She shared the food, the cheap canned dog food Elias brought, throwing it on the floor like animals. Karen made sure everyone ate their share, even as her stomach cramped with cramps of disgust. She whispered to them about home, about families, about simple things, the taste of coffee, the smell of rain, the softness of a bed. She tried to keep them sane by creating an anchor that would keep them in reality. Karen began keeping an imaginary calendar, scratching with her fingernail in the farthest corner behind the mattress where the cameras couldn't capture it. But her biggest job became planning. Karen began to notice patterns in her brother's behavior. She studied the schedule of their visits, the sounds coming from upstairs, trying to figure out when no one was in the house. She noticed that in the corner under the ceiling where the rusty vent pipe ran, the concrete was beginning to crumble from the dampness. It was a tiny chance, almost impossible, but it was all she had left. Months went by, adding up to an endless nightmare. Hope melted like wax. The women's physical condition deteriorated. Their hair fell out. Their skin turned gray from lack of sun and vitamins, their bodies covered with sores. But Karen continued her quiet struggle. One evening, when Elias brought another drink of water, he looked at Edna with a look Karen had never seen before. It was not the look of an executioner on his victim, but something else. A mixture of curiosity and sickening awe. He didn't strike her as he usually did, but gently placed the bowl next to her. Karen felt a cold dread clench her heart. The rules of the game were changing, and she didn't know what new abyss Silas's sick mind had in store for them. Events: June 2017, February 2018. Time had ceased to exist in the bunker. It became a viscous, homogeneous mass of darkness, interrupted only by the rough intrusion of the kidnappers. But the human body has its own inexorable clock. By the early summer of 2017, after nearly 9 months of captivity, Edna Howell began to feel a change. First, it was nausea, which she blamed on the disgusting food. Then, an inexplicable fatigue. In complete darkness, listening to her body, she realized the truth. The truth was so monstrous that it robbed her of the remnants of her will for days. She was pregnant. That discovery, whispered in the rare moments when they dared to speak, changed everything. When Silas, the older brother, found out, his madness took on a new, terrifying vector. According to Karen's testimony, he did not fly into a rage. On the contrary, he was overcome with a creepy, messianic euphoria. He entered the bunker, and for the first time in many months, he had not a hose in his hand, but a dim flashlight. He pointed the beam at Edna, studying her like an outlandish artifact. Then he announced that it was a sign from above. He proclaimed Edna a sacred vessel, chosen to nurture the first man of the new, pure world. From that day forward, the dynamics in the basement split. Silas categorically forbade Elias from touching Edna. The physical abuse of her had stopped, but it was replaced by suffocating psychological terror. Silas sat at the bunker door for hours, reciting his insane sermons to the unborn child. He brought Edna gifts, slightly better food, sometimes even a bottle of water. But his every action was imbued with a sinister obsession. Edna was no longer human. In his sick mind, she became an incubator for his delusions. Deprived of his main target, Elias, the younger and more primitive of the brothers, directed all his uncontrolled aggression at the two remaining women. As Karen later recounted, the violence against her and Stella escalated manifold. Elias seemed to be taking revenge on them for not being chosen. He beat them for the slightest rustle, for a look he didn't like. Stella, who had been teetering on the brink for a long time, had finally withdrawn into herself, her consciousness finding refuge where none of her brothers could reach. It was then, looking at her pregnant, exhausted friend and the broken, silent Stella, that Karen Warren, the nurse, made her decision. She understood what her captors did not. Giving birth in these unsanitary, bacteria-infested conditions without medical attention was certain death. It would be the end for both Edna and the baby. Hope for outside rescue had long since died. If they wanted to survive, she had to act on her own. That knowledge was the catalyst that turned a passive victim into a calculating strategist. Her plan was desperate and required almost inhuman patience. One day, during another feeding, she managed to stealthily push a metal spoon against the wall and hide it. This small, rusty piece of metal became her only tool and symbol of hope. Her target was a tiny ceiling vent, barely visible in the dark. It was bolted shut with rusty bolts. Month after month, in total darkness, when her brothers were asleep or away, Karen spent hours loosening one of the bolts, risking to be heard. She worked with the tip of a spoon, centimeter by centimeter, peeling the skin off her fingers. Every creak of metal thundered in her ears. The night of the escape, according to Karen, had not been planned. On a cold February night, she heard the brothers arguing loudly upstairs, followed by the sound of Elias's drunken snoring. There was an unusual silence, and in that silence, Karen heard something she had never heard before. A click. Elias, drunk, had forgotten to lock the second, inner door leading from the hallway into the main house. The bolt on the grate was barely holding. It was her only chance. With an inhuman effort, she bent the bars, squeezed through the narrow, dusty gap, and made her way out into the hallway. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she could hear it throughout the house. She crept past the room where Elias slept and slipped through the unlocked back door to the outside. The icy air burned her lungs, but she was only out for a moment. Silas, suffering from paranoia, had set up a rudimentary surveillance system, a single camera aimed at the corridor outside the bunker. He saw the empty corridor on the monitor in his room. There was a furious scream. Karen rushed out running, unable to see the road. Behind her, she heard the rattle of a door opening and Silas's frantic shouts, and then the click of a shotgun bolt. She ran through thorny bushes, over frozen ground, feeling no pain from the sharp stones beneath her bare feet. The forest that had once seemed beautiful to her had turned into a dark, hostile maze. Ahead, she saw the lights of a passing car and ran out onto the highway, waving her arms desperately. The car, without slowing down, sped past. But in the distance, in the foggy haze, she saw a faint, saving glow, the sign of a 24-hour gas station. As the sirens of distant ambulances taking exhausted women to the trauma center in Poplar Bluff faded into the night, a very different kind of operation was unfolding on Blackwood Ridge. With the arrest of the passive and broken Elias, only half the threat was eliminated. The other, and as it soon became clear, far more dangerous half, Silas Crenshaw, had vanished into the forest darkness. For the Missouri State Police, this marked the beginning of one of the most desperate and intense raids in their history. It wasn't just a fugitive against them. Against them was a prophet in his own wild kingdom. Silas was armed with at least one rifle, and unlike the officers, to whom this dense, rugged landscape was foreign territory, to him it was home. He knew every trail, every ravine, and every cave. The first thing the forensics team did was begin a thorough search of the farmhouse, and what they found made the blood run cold in their veins. In the house, among the mountains of trash and rotting food scraps, diaries were found. Dozens of thick notebooks written in Silas's scrawled, feverish handwriting. They weren't just notes. They were the Bible of his madness. The pages were filled with rambling sermons, apocalyptic prophecies of fiery purification, and detailed descriptions of the sins of the outside world. But that was not what was most disturbing. Among the rambling texts, the police found hand-drawn diagrams. They were maps of old abandoned mine tunnels that snaked through the hills in the area, the legacy of a long-forgotten mining industry. Silas wasn't just running. He had a plan and plenty of places to hide. The search operation unfolded at dawn. Helicopters hovered in the air, their thermal imaging cameras scanning the cold ground for signs of human body heat. Dozens of police cars and SUVs combed the forest roads. Canine units picked up the trail from the farm, but wet weather and difficult terrain hampered their work. Silas Crenshaw disappeared. He'd been in hiding for 2 days. Those 48 hours were filled with oppressive tension. The police officers combing the woods felt constantly under surveillance. They knew that the man they were looking for was watching them, perhaps through the scope of his rifle. To him, they were not guardians of the law, but demons in uniform, messengers of the very infected world from which he was trying to escape. On the 3rd day, luck finally smiled on the searchers. One of the dogs, working in the area of the abandoned silver mines quarry, suddenly froze and then barked furiously, pulling the leash toward a rocky ledge. The place was desolate and ominous. Rusted hulks of old equipment, rubble-strewn entrances to adits. The dog led the group to a shallow cave hidden behind dense shrubbery. There was his rookery. Crumpled grass, an empty tin can, and fresh tracks. He was close. The encirclement ring began to tighten. The SWAT team, moving silently, took up positions around the perimeter of the quarry. They had him cornered. And Silas realized it. But he wasn't about to give up. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the top of one of the dumps. A bullet whistled over the officers' heads. And then came his voice, the frantic, screeching cry of a preacher. He shouted curses, calling the police officers servants of the foul and messengers of the apocalypse. He didn't shoot back to escape. He was fighting his last battle, his last sermon to a hostile world. The firefight was short. Silas, standing to his full height, fired at random, not caring for his own safety. At one point, as he was reloading his rifle, a sniper from the SWAT team fired a single, accurate shot. The bullet hit Silas in the shoulder, knocking the weapon from his hands. He collapsed to the ground. The snatch team instantly went into motion. They rushed toward him, but even wounded, he continued to fight back desperately, biting and snarling like a wild animal. They twisted him, pressing him to the cold, stony ground. As the handcuffs snapped on his wrists and blood soaked his clothes, he did not stop screaming. His eyes burned with fanatical fire, and his voice, full of hatred and unbroken faith in his own madness, echoed through the empty quarry. "You have changed nothing," he wheezed as he was dragged toward the armored van. The purge is not complete. With the Crenshaw brothers in custody and their victims evacuated, Blackwood Ridge Farm was transformed from a crime scene into a mausoleum to be dissected. Over the course of weeks, investigators and forensic experts methodically dismantled the layers of dirt, debris, and madness that had accumulated in the house. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mold and lingering fear. Every object, from the dirty dishes in the sink to the stacks of yellowed newspapers, was seen as a potential clue, a piece of the puzzle that could explain what had happened here. And they found what they were looking for. In an old wooden trunk littered with tattered clothing lay a collection of VHS videotapes. At first, the detectives assumed they were just old movies. But when the first tape was inserted into the VCR in the sheriff's office, the room fell into a ringing silence. On the screen, in a grainy, jittery image, Silas Crenshaw appeared. He was looking directly into the lens, and his eyes burned with fanatical fire. He was reading one of his sermons. This was just the beginning. The brothers, in their megalomaniacal delirium, decided that their mission should be documented for future generations. They recorded everything. The tapes contained hours of Silas's insane monologues, his apocalyptic visions, and explanations of their twisted theology. But there was more to the tapes. There were recorded snippets of bullying. A tripod-mounted camera impassively recorded scenes of punishment, moments when the prisoners were denied food, hours spent in total darkness. The recording quality was terrible, the sound muffled, but the horror documented on the tape was undeniable. These tapes became the key, irrefutable evidence for the prosecution. They were so gruesome, so inhumane, that after the first private viewing, the district attorney made an unprecedented decision. The jury would never be shown the videos. Instead, only the transcripts would be read to them, dry text devoid of the visual nightmare that lawyers feared could make any objective judgment impossible. While investigators were immersed in documenting the madness, in the sterile wards of the trauma center, doctors were struggling with its aftermath. The health of the surviving women became their primary concern. For Edna Howell, the culmination of her suffering coincided with a miracle. Her body, depleted by months of malnutrition and stress, was too weak for natural childbirth. Doctors performed an emergency C-section, and, against all predictions, a healthy baby girl was born. Medics who had seen a lot later admitted that they could not believe in the vitality of this child, born in hell. The girl became a quiet but powerful symbol that life can triumph even in the most impenetrable darkness. Stella Gomez's fate was different. Her physical condition slowly improved, but her mind remained captive. She was in a deep dissociative state, which psychiatrists described as a protective wall built by the mind against intolerable trauma. She didn't speak, her gaze was blank and unfocused. She ate when fed and slept when given sleeping pills. The doctors said she had a long, possibly lifelong road of rehabilitation ahead of her. Her silence was as loud a testament to the Crenshaw brothers' crimes as the screams on the videotapes. Karen Warren, who plucked them all out of that hell, became the voice of the prosecution. Despite her own exhaustion, she spent hours testifying to detectives. Her memory was sharp and her details precise. She methodically described the hierarchy of violence, the roles the brothers played, their rules and rituals. She recounted the most elaborate form of their torture. According to her, the brothers often played out a diabolical spectacle. By committing a minor misdemeanor, such as spilling water, one of the girls would incur the wrath of all. Then Silas or Elias would put them in a row and make them decide for themselves which of the three of them would be punished for their common guilt. It was a cruel psychological game designed to break their will, destroy their friendship, make them hate each other. According to Karen, it was the brothers' only plan that failed. They never chose. They silently took their punishment together. So by the end of March, the prosecution had all the evidence it needed. Live witnesses, irrefutable medical reports, and dozens of hours of videotape documenting systematic torture. The case seemed clear and indisputable. The path to conviction and the harshest punishment seemed straight and short. But while the prosecutor was preparing his case based on this evidence of pure evil, the attorneys assigned to the Crenshaw brothers were reviewing the same tapes. And in the crazed eyes of Prophet Silas, they saw not criminal intent, but something else entirely. The Crenshaw brothers' trial, which had begun in the spring of 2019, had instantly turned from a local trial into a national event. Television vans from all over the country surrounded the courthouse, and the story of the Blackwood Ridge monsters became the lead story on the news broadcasts. The public, frightened and angry, was hungry for one thing: retribution. The prosecution seemed to have all the trump cards: hard evidence, shocking videotapes, and most importantly, the testimony of the surviving victim. The fact that the crimes, kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, torture, and systematic rape had been committed was undeniable. However, the state-appointed defense chose the only possible but extremely risky and unpopular strategy. They did not challenge the facts. Instead, they questioned the very foundation of guilt: the defendant's sanity. Their argument was based on a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. For several weeks in the courtroom, the battle unfolded not of lawyers, but of psychiatrists. Experts invited by the defense presented their findings one after another. Both brothers, Elias and Silas, were diagnosed with profound, chronic paranoid schizophrenia. Their condition, doctors claimed, was exacerbated by decades of isolation and a rare psychiatric phenomenon known as induced delirium, folie à deux, in which the delusions of one dominant individual, Silas, are completely shared and supported by another, more driven one, Elias. They weren't just pretending. They were really living in their own twisted reality, where their actions were not crimes, but a sacred duty. The trial culminated with the presentation of the prosecution's star witness, Karen Warren. When she entered the room, there was complete silence. She looked collected, her gaze firm. She walked to the podium and looked directly at her tormentors. The Crenshaw brothers sat at the defense table. They were nothing like the all-powerful fathers they had been in the bunker. Now they were two broken, medically suppressed men in orange robes. Because of repeated outbursts of uncontrollable aggression during preliminary hearings, the court had ordered them to wear special anti-bite masks and straitjackets. In a calm, steady voice that only occasionally shook, Karen recounted the 16 months of hell. She talked about the constant hunger, the cold, the darkness. She talked about Edna's pregnancy, how that event changed the dynamic in the bunker, turning her friend into a sacred vessel. She told of how they survived, not alone, but together, supporting each other in whispers, sharing crumbs of food, and maintaining humanity where there seemed to be nothing human left. Her testimony was more than an account of suffering. It was a hymn to friendship and an unyielding will to live. After several days of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. The foreman read the verdict on each count of the indictment: kidnapping, rape, torture. On each of these counts, the jury found that the Crenshaw brothers had been proven to have committed the crime. There was a sigh of relief in the room. But then the foreman turned to the main issue, that of sanity. And here came the words that shocked the whole country: not guilty by reason of insanity. This decision caused a wave of indignation. But the judge, following the letter of the law, explained that this was not an excuse. Given the unchallenged and unanimous opinions of all the psychiatrists involved in the case, the jury could not have reached a different conclusion. But that didn't mean the Crenshaw brothers would go free. The judge issued a final order. Send Elias and Silas Crenshaw to Fulton State Hospital, a maximum security facility for mentally ill criminals. They were ordered involuntary treatment for an indefinite period of time, with no right to review the conditions of confinement. In fact, it was a life sentence. Not in a prison cell, but in the padded room of a mental institution, where their inner demons would be their only neighbors for the rest of their lives. A few months after the trial, Edna Howell made the hardest decision of her life. She gave her newborn baby girl up for adoption to a closed family. She realized that no matter how much she loved this child, she would never be able to look at her without remembering the horror of her origins. It was an act not of abdication, but of the greatest love, a desire to give her daughter a chance at a normal life, unmarred by the shadow of Blackwood Ridge. The three friends, forever bound by a shared trauma, began a long and painful journey toward healing. They left Missouri trying to relearn to live, to trust, to not be afraid of the dark. Their friendship, forged in unimaginable suffering, became their only support. The nightmare in the Ozark woods is over, but its echoes will haunt them always, like a quiet, inexorable whisper in the silence.